Do it. Damn, I was gonna say you should do it with absolutely no context about what that sound is, about what David's doing.
Right. Yeah, we'll just have that in the background of the recording. The swish swish of David's broom. We will periodically interrupt the recording to have updates about how the grill is going. So what do folks know about Stephen? What do you guys remember about Stephen?
He was a replacement.
Martyred.
Go ahead, Mitch.
No, just that he was martyred.
Okay. So what you remember about Stephen is that Stephen is no more.
Yes, that is what I remember.
What do you remember, Craig?
He was a replacement.
So he was, he was chosen basically as a deacon, and kind of was the one we heard the most about, because the early church was not treating Israeli Jews and Hellenistic Jews, or Jews from throughout the empire, living in Jerusalem equally. So he got chosen as one of the 7 deacons. And pretty much all of the 7 deacons that were chosen were Hellenistic Jews, we can tell from their names. I was looking up and trying to figure out if they were like converts to Judaism, but it seems like in Stephen's case, at least, he was probably just a Jewish person born to a Jew that happened to be living outside of Jerusalem and Israel at the time. So not a convert, but raised Jewish as well. So let me read a little bit from the text. I don't think I want to read the whole thing, because that would pretty much take us up until noon. And let me just see if I can. I was going to share.
Oh, I thought you were going to have like James Earl Jones read it for us or something.
No.
Oh, I'm disappointed.
Sorry.
And in the beginning.
All right.
The Lord created the heavens and the earth.
Okay, so chapter 7 starts with, then the priest asked him, "Are these things so?" So we probably need to go back to figure out what these things are.
Then they secretly instigated some men to say, "We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God." They stirred up the people as well as the elders and the scribes. Then they suddenly confronted him, seized him, and brought him before the council. They set up false witnesses who said, "This man never stops saying things against this holy place and the law. For we have heard him say, this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and will change the customs that Moses handed unto us." And all who sat in the council looked intently at him, and they saw that his face was like the face of an angel.
I'm getting very Monty Python vibes right now.
David goes for James Earl Jones and ends up somewhere around John Cleese.
That was good, Craig.
So those are the things that Stephen's going to talk about. Do any of those sound familiar? I guess if we were doing the 4 quadrants, I would say, do we see connections to anything else in the text here?
Well, they said the same thing about Jesus.
So which things?
Well, that they heard him speak blasphemous things, like when he said he would tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Same kind of thing.
Okay. And also the customs or the law, that
Yeah.
are you here to replace the law or to fulfill it? Right. So, so as you guys know, I usually think of the text more as a text written, like think of this not as like watching a news report, but as, something composed by Luke, or, as an author. And so yeah, I think this is one of the places that we see Luke setting up Stephen as kind of a refiguration of Jesus. And I think by putting Stephen in that position, he's kind of trying to say that the ministry of Jesus has continued in the early church, and that the persecution is going to continue in the early church. So the high priest, so he goes before the council or the Sanhedrin, and the high priest asks him, are these things so? And so he's basically asking him his defense against these accusations that specifically about tearing down the temple or changing the customs of Moses. And it's interesting, I think, because it's set up as they set up false witnesses who said this, but all of the things that they're accusing him of saying are things that are based in kind of the sayings of Jesus, so they're accusing him, as they say, falsely, but it's not as if he is going to be denying he's not going to be denying the substance of the claims, or how does he deny these claims but defend what Jesus did? So, as I said, chapter 7 is his defense. It is the longest speech we have recorded in Acts. I don't know if I should say recorded or reconstructed, because obviously Luke was not there, but he's reconstructing this speech after the fact. And so either it was similar to things that Stephen had said, or it's what Luke had wanted to say. But without reading the whole thing, essentially, I figured this would be a good way to kind of talk about it, where I can scroll through it pretty easily. He starts by giving kind of the history of Israel from Abraham on. So kind of where we are right now in the Torah portions is more or less where he starts, when God covenants with Abraham and asks him to leave and go to this promised land. There we have circumcision. So verse 8, we've got that covered, Craig.
Whoop,
Uh,
whoop.
and then we move on to we quickly skip over Isaac and Jacob and go to Joseph. And so that's kind of the next. So we start with Abraham. We start with him outside of the land. We quickly kind of skip generations. So we end up with Egypt. And really what we talk about with Joseph is Joseph's time in Egypt. And then the beginning of Exodus. He recounts the story of Moses confronting and killing the Egyptian, and then being confronted by the other Israelites. And God comes and rescues them from Egypt. So we go from Abraham to Joseph to Moses, and they start talking. One of the important episodes that he talks about with Moses is the golden calf, and about sacrifice. And he talks about the tabernacle, and then finally he kind of ends up with David and Solomon, and it says that, but it was Solomon who built a house for him, that the Most High does not dwell in houses made with human hands, as the prophet said. Heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me, or what is my place of rest? Did not my hand make all these things? So even with that brief summary, what would you say the themes are in Stephen's response to the accusations that he was going to destroy the temple and that he was going to change the customs of Moses?
He's basically saying, dude, you don't know anything I know all about Moses. What are you talking about? I wouldn't try to overturn the Moses. I know all the Moses. This is just for about 50 verses.
So basically, like his first defense is to kind of recite back to them the history of Israel, to kind of both show that he knows, that he knows the history of Israel, that he's a true Jew. So even though he's a Hellenistic Jew, he's still a true Jew. He knows, he knows the Jewish story. And so if he is being accused of changing the customs, it's not because he doesn't know them. It's not because as a Hellenistic Jew, he holds to something different. Any other themes you saw in those 50 verses in kind of how he recites the history of Israel? I thought it was interesting that for most of it, he's emphasizing that Israel, that the Jewish people are not in the Jewish land through most of their history. So he keeps citing, so he starts in Mesopotamia and Haran. And then after the covenant, he basically skips all the way forward to Joseph, once Joseph enters Egypt. So again, not in the promised land. And then he talks about Moses in Egypt. He talks about Moses and the Israelites on Sinai, but he doesn't really talk much about them at all in the actual promised land. So I thought that was interesting that maybe as a Jew that grew up outside of the Promised Land himself, he was emphasizing how much of the story of Israel, even though it's tied around this covenant to the Promised Land, that God is acting in all of the patriarchs' lives outside of the Promised Land. And it kind of culminates with him answering that charge about worship in the temple, where he talks, he basically brings up two incidents, and one of them is the sacrifices to the golden calf and worshiping images that are made by hands. And then the prophet Amos saying, basically, why do I need a building to dwell in? And
one of the things that I think has stood out, like in what you had to say and what Craig, is that really it's recounting God's faithfulness to the people of Israel, regardless if they're in the land or if they're not in the land. God has shown his faithfulness through all of these generations. And then we get to the end of this, and basically we find out that Israel is not faithful to God. Through all these generations, there's been like a failure of the Israelite people to live up to the covenant and to love God.
Yeah, and I think the last paragraph, which is what I was going to read out in full, kind of talks about that unfaithfulness, or at least rejection of God's prophets or messengers. So starting in 51, do you want to read this, David? You're still muted, just a sec.
Oh, you should have let him finish.
You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you are forever opposing the Holy Spirit, just as your ancestors used to do. Which of the prophets did your ancestors not persecute? They killed those who foretold the coming of the righteous one. And now you have become his betrayers and murderers. You are the ones that received the law as ordained by angels, and you yet have not kept it.
Thank you, David.
My pleasure.
So his final part of his defense is basically to turn it back on the Sanhedrin and on the basically on the Jewish elders and the Jewish establishment, to say, that they continue to either not recognize or not accept God's prophets and messengers. So he ties that back to the Jesus movement and to their crucifixion of Jesus by doing that. So then the outcome is, of course, reasoned debate. No, just kidding. The outcome is that when they heard these things, they became enraged and ground their teeth at Stephen. But filled with the Holy Spirit, he gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. "Look," he said, "I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." But they covered their ears, and with a loud shout, all rushed together against him. Then they dragged him out of the city and began to stone him. And the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. While they were stoning Stephen, he prayed. This is Stephen, not Saul. Stephen prayed, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." And then he knelt down and cried out in a loud voice, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." When he had said this, he died, and Saul approved of their killing. So,
Sounds familiar.
yeah, I was going to say, so if we're looking for connections or echoes of other parts of the text, what sounded familiar to you, Craig?
Oh, the forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. When people are confronted by their own hypocrisy and I guess iniquities, evil, they get really indignant and lash out instead of looking inside. I mean, it's basically a carbon copy of what happened to Jesus.
Right. And so I was trying to look, I think some of these are in the John tradition, some of them are in the Luke tradition or other gospel traditions, but right, both the phrases, receive my spirit and, do not hold this against them or forgive them. They do not know what they're doing. Either Stephen is repeating what he had heard about or from Jesus, or Luke is intentionally making it so, so that we will read this and immediately think of Jesus.
But there is no, it is finished.
I guess what we get instead of that is when he said this, he died, and Saul approved of their killing him. So,
I think maybe that's an illusion, or maybe is there a correlation to what Craig is saying, that there was no "it is finished"? So is there then more to come? And that's the seed that's planted by Luke. Is there a seed planted by Luke that Saul has more of a role to play?
I'm thinking of of a Star Wars reference at this point, which is,
jeez.
If you strike me down, I will become more powerful than you can imagine. But I do think you're right, David, in that Luke is
Luke Skywalker or Luke in the which
no,
Luke?
not
Luke Skywalker. Luke Skywalker.
Luke the Evangelist.
Everybody stop. Stop it right now. You guys stop.
So I think the author of the book of Acts, let me put it that way, is kind of hinging what they're telling, like this becomes a turning point in the book of Acts. So up until now, everything that's happened has basically happened in Jerusalem. And we've only brought in elements from outside of Jerusalem in the sense that we talk about the Hellenistic Jews that are from outside of Jerusalem living in Jerusalem, or the people that worship or that study at the synagogue of the freedmen, where it describes their nationalities as being from outside of Jerusalem. But after this, the immediate pivot is persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and everyone gets scattered outside of Judea and Samaria. And so, so this does mark a turning point for the early church movement from being something small and local and in Jerusalem to something being, as the Great Commission says at the beginning of Acts, from here, eventually to the corners of the earth, And so this is, if we went back to the beginning of Acts, I'm not going to do it on the screen because it'll be too easy to lose my place. But in my other text here, this kind of marks a shift of focus from Jerusalem out of Jerusalem. And then, of course, eventually, Peter's still going to play a role in the next few chapters, but then eventually the focus of Acts is going to shift to Saul's conversion and Paul. So it's not like immediate, like there's not an immediate handoff of the baton between, and Saul approved of their killing him, and then him being struck blind on the road to Damascus. We have kind of an interlude where we are talking about the changing conception of, is this what is the relationship between this sect of Judaism, this Christ sect of Judaism, and the rest of Judaism, as Peter is basically asked to question the applicability of purity laws, for example, do purity laws trump people? So I think, in some ways, Stephen's speech kind of sets that up when he's talking about, as Mitch said, that God's faithfulness to the covenant did not only happen within the promised land, that God was faithful to the people wherever they were. And that their track record of faithfulness was that they would keep questioning and persecuting the prophets that God would send to him and the messengers. And so, so I think it's like Stephen uses Jesus as the example of the persecuted and rejected prophet, and Luke uses Stephen as the example of the persecuted and rejected prophet, because the irony that's being presented here is that as soon as he says that you killed those that foretold the coming of the righteous ones, and you become betrayers and murderers, the immediate reaction is to murder him. So it's like, by being so enraged by this, they basically prove it to be true, that they are at this moment receiving a message from God and are going to murder the person who did it. So I guess some of the other things that we often look at would be, we've talked about connections to other parts of the text. We've talked about some of the allusions to and parallels to Jesus on the cross. I guess one of the other quadrants we can talk about would be, what questions does this bring up for you? Do you have questions about the text that we could maybe investigate and come back with? Or what questions do you have after reading this text about yourself or about how we do things? another way to say that would be, I think our natural desire would be to identify with Stephen in this text, but how are we also the Sanhedrin, the betrayers, Saul? Like, I think it's very, I won't say it's easy. I was going to say, I think it's very much what we want to do, to always identify ourselves with the protagonist in the biblical story. But I think it can be more honest to look at multiple perspectives in the text and say, in addition to asking, well, how are we like Stephen? How are we persecuted? How are we not listened to? How are we, asked to be models of Christ for others? But then also say, well, how do we reject God's messengers? How do we approve of acts of violence that we don't take part in? So that last line, and Saul approved of their killing him while he's sitting there with the coats. So how do we approve of violence that we're not taking part in? And does not taking part in it absolve us of the violence, or is that the approval? Is not stopping it. So what questions do you guys have in the text, or what do you feel about kind of identifying with Stephen or with Saul or with the people that were threatened by what they saw as change? So this whole thing happens because he's accused at the beginning of basically advocating against the temple system or trying to change the customs handed down by Moses.
I think one of the it's not so much of a question, but the observation I had was that the persecution led to like kind of kicking them in the ass to fulfill the Great Commission. Like you said, they were kind of stuck in Jerusalem land, and they were kind of scattered because of the persecution, and were made to go out and fulfill all this, kind of like the Tower of Babel thing. Like if you guys all just stay in the same land, where you're all just gonna fester here, and they were spread out this time by persecution. That's kind of a parallel I read into this and read into my own life and life as a whole. Like sometimes you need a kick in the ass to not fester and wallow in your own routines.
Yeah, and I think sometimes those kind of thoughts like almost ask or invite the question of, so basically, did God cause the death of Stephen to accomplish the Great Commission? Like that's one way you could read that, and it's one way that I think we try to make sense of tragedy.
I don't think that, by the way.
Right, but I was going to say, but what I hear you saying, Craig, is no. But God doesn't allow or encourage the persecution and killing of Stephen, knowing that this will happen. However,
You can use
God's
it.
purposes, right, can be accomplished, you know, even with this. And in fact, you know, I would say, like you said, it happened in the way that it happened at this particular time and to these particular places because of this. Even if it would have happened at a different time or in a different way without this. I also thought it was interesting if we connect this back to Stephen's identity as a Hellenistic Jew. The reason we have Jews throughout the empire is because first the Babylonian exile, you know, took them out of the promised land and they flourished, and not all returned to Israel. You know, then that was the first time that they were part of really a bigger empire. And then so many remained in Babylon. That's where the Babylonian Talmud was written down. You know, that's where, you know, the Torah might have been written from an oral tradition into a written tradition for the first times. You know, the Roman Empire has come in and through conscription and other things taken Jews out of Jerusalem and the promised land. And that's why we have Hellenistic Jews, you know, is because empire has come in and through persecution and misfortune ended up spreading Judaism beyond the promised land throughout the entire Babylonian, you know, throughout the Babylonian Empire, throughout the Assyrian Empire, throughout the Roman Empire, because they come in, they disrupt, and then God uses that movement of his people to have influence throughout the world. And so, you know, I'm seeing kind of those historic exiles that ultimately spread Judaism far and wide. Like you said, Craig, you know, this persecution is ultimately going to backfire and spread Christianity, or this idea from within Judaism, far and wide throughout both Jews living elsewhere in the Roman Empire and eventually to Gentiles throughout the empire and to us.
And that same argument can be a double-edged sword too, though. When people imagine their own persecution, or try to invent their own persecution, so that they feel more connected to these stories, and then it takes them into a whole different path of thinking. You know, like I guess everyone, not just Christians or whatever, but everyone feels persecuted in some way or another, and can use that persecution to justify the things they do or say, and the way they live, I guess. But that in this regard, where it's at the base of it's at the like the fundamentals of the movement. I think their persecution spreading them out led to better things than if they would have just stayed in Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
If that made any sense.
No, I think so, because I think part of the danger, if you will, of staying in Jerusalem is exactly what Stephen is talking against here, is creating a caste system based upon, well, first of all, based upon geography, based upon genealogy, you know, who is the better Jew? The one that lives in Jerusalem, the one that lives in Samaria, the one that lives in Greece or Rome, you know, who is the better Jew, the one who was born a Jew or the one that converted to Judaism, you know? And, you know, and you can see the beginning of that, because remember the first kind of persecution of the Hellenistic Jews in the church is not from outside the church. The whole reason Stephen is a deacon is because the church was already discriminating against those who were ethnically or outside of the promised land, you know, the Hellenistic Jews or the Hellenized Jews, you know. So so I think you're right that, you know, there were certain dangers the longer that the movement remained purely a Jerusalem thing or a Israel thing.
You can say that that's still happening, even to today.
Oh yeah. Yeah, all of those things I said about hierarchies, you know, the church is very good at them. I think in some ways my experience is that the evangelical church is very good at what you said about you know, if we can only imagine ourselves as the persecuted, as the oppressed, if we only claim that part of the story or that perspective on the story, you know, I mean, that's a temptation that we see in Western Christianity, to say that, you know, that the state, or however you want to define empire, that culture is persecuting, you know, Christians. You know, I definitely saw in my more evangelical culture churches hierarchies based upon, did you convert or were you born? You know, because of the whole idea of you know, of evangelism is that you convert and that you are born again. And so for someone who was raised in a mainline Protestant church, who was baptized as an infant, you know,
You're not a real Christian. What are you doing?
Right. In evangelical culture, I was definitely a second class, you know, Christian, because I did not have a dramatic conversion story or moments where, you know, I said the words.
The Blues Brothers moment.
Right. Right. So, yeah, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod was not really a Blues Brothers kind of atmosphere. Any other thoughts about this chapter, about Stephen, about what this means for us, about where we can identify? I guess also,
I have two observations. One, kind of connecting back to the Jesus story and its relationship to the Stephen story, is that I see nowhere in the text where any of Stephen's fellow deacons or any of the apostles present. So I don't know what's up with that. But, you know, you were talking about defending the persecution. So defending Stephen, where were the other deacons? Where were the other apostles? So I've never noticed that in a text before. And the other thing that I noticed is this emphasis that Stephen, and I'm really wrestling with this, and I really want to dig into this a little bit more. But Stephen ends his whole narrative with this story about the temple, which I find to be really relevant, because the temple is centered in Jerusalem, okay, which where everybody else is centered is into Jerusalem. And personally, this is Mitch's Midrash, and with this and $2, you can go to Starbucks and get yourself a cup of coffee. But
so this is the Midrash.
This is the Midrash, not the Midrash, or the Mag Stage, whatever you want to call it.
The Midrash with the Mag Stash.
Yeah, that's right. I don't think God ever intended the Israelites to build a temple. They had a tabernacle, and the tabernacle moved with the people wherever they went. And so God moved with the people even when they weren't in the promised land. There's a bunch of reasons why I believe that. One is that the nation of Israel actually conscripted people just like the Egyptians in order to build the temple. And that was part of the reason of the split between the northern and the southern kingdoms, but that's for another day and another story. It seems that everything is focused on the holiness of the temple, the holiness of place, without regard of the holiness of God himself. So I find this whole story about the temple, again, I don't think I've even begun to plumb the depths of this and why Stephen used this as an example, but I think it's really worth diving into on why he ended up with the story about the temple. Again, I think it has a lot to do with the complete emphasis on this holiness of place. And we completely separate that from God sometimes, and also from the intrinsic holiness of people as being the recipient of the image of God. So anyway.
No, I definitely saw that when I was studying up for this, that in part that was one of the primary kind of arguments of the Hellenistic Jews, was this idea that the temple was not the tabernacle, that the tabernacle was something that was ordained for a certain time and place in the wilderness, and that after that, once they were in the Holy Land, God was to dwell in the land with them, and therefore did not need a tabernacle, and then did not therefore also need a temple or any type of house. And your part about the holiness of the temple versus the holiness of God. Some of the commentaries pointed out that at the beginning, he starts his speech with, "The glory of God appeared to our ancestor." And then he ends it with his vision and saying, "I see the heavens open," and he gazed and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. And so in the composition of the defense and of this chapter, it begins and ends and is encompassed with the idea of the glory of God, and not the glory of Israel or the glory of the temple. So I think your analysis or framing of that is very consistent with kind of what the thought was of Hellenized Jews at the time, to say, well, how am I a Jew? Like, am I less of a Jew the further away from the temple I am? Or am I more a Jew the closer to the physical temple that I am?
Well, what's
and
really
we already have the synagogue system too, so it's not like we aren't already moving into that system where God is present and discussed and studied outside of the temple, and so we already have that. And I don't know about in terms of composition of the book of Acts, but presumably, given how far the book of Acts goes, it was composed after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So as it's being written, the temple is already in past tense, but written about in present tense, and putting arguments in about, and so I think in some ways this argument about the temple is both a theological argument about where is the glory of God, but it's also a very practical self-identity argument for Jews now living in a time without a temple.
Right. Right.
You know.
Yeah, I find it interesting too, at the beginning of the book of Acts, Jesus gave them the Great Commission, go into Jerusalem, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. So, Samaria being equated with the northern kingdom. So basically those in diaspora who were part of the northern kingdom, they were the ones who were truly scattered about the face of the earth. So yeah, I think it connects well with this as well.
So I guess I'll leave us as our kind of final reflection or homework would be, how do we connect this back to Acts as a manual for fighting oppression? And so I think that's a question that I haven't fully, when I was studying this, I hadn't fully figured out kind of where that connection was. And I have little bits that I'm exploring, but yeah, I might be asking you guys about that at a different time. If you guys have any thoughts about how does this relate back to how do we in our current day fight oppression?